Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from your break. My name is David Sequeira and I'll be chairing this session. Just a little bit about me. I'm an artist and art consultant. I work in museums. I also work with the corporate sector in training and development, using art as a metaphor for business development and staff management. So pretty much my life has been about bringing people of all different backgrounds to a deeper and richer appreciation of the place that art can play in their lives. My real commitment, my real love is urban renewal through the arts. So smarter, better cities. When I was thinking about this session, I began to think about The Simpsons. Now, there is an episode of The Simpsons where Marge Simpson is actually looking at the floor, and there on the floor is an issue of the magazine Better Homes Than Yours. Better Homes Than Yours is a magazine which many residents of Springfield read. Marge finds a copy on the floor and is dismayed that the perfect living room depicted on the cover of the magazine does not mirror her living room. This session is titled Smarter, Better Cities. Here's what it's not titled. It's not titled Richer, Prettier Cities. It's not titled Brighter, Cleaner Cities. It's not titled More Glamorous, Famous Cities. It's not titled More Comfortable, Relaxed Cities, although they may be outcomes of this discussion. See, as Marge discovered, the notion of smarter and better is relative. My suspicion, and indeed my hope, is that this session will create more questions than answers. And given our panel, we are really in good hands to tease out and unpack the notion of smarter, better cities. My intention is that this session is really a place of speculation grounded in the work and ideas in which our panellists engage.
What are smart cities? Obviously, this is a highly opinionated statement. Smart cities are not dysfunctional. They're not dysfunctional in terms of social equity. They're not dysfunctional in terms of too much traffic congestion, or just generally not working to the ends of the citizens' needs. Smart cities attract and retain smart people. Smart cities have, I think, courteous conversations about their present and their future, and what's needed to ensure future livability, future fairness and future prosperity, and a sufficient quality of life. Smart cities need engaged citizens and good governance, and they also need to harness the tools that technology have to offer, and harnessing those tools and that technology is essential to having properly engaged citizens and good governance in this day and age. Smart cities understand the power and the impact of the forces of agglomeration in a city, or the forces that drive cities towards cityness, which in turn makes them smarter and smarter. Smart cities understand that managing change and growth is a key function of any city government and governance. Smart cities and their stakeholders collaborate to compete. Now, this is putting this out there. I think at this time, despite the best efforts of policymakers, that there is nevertheless a big gap, certainly in Australia, between what policymakers think good policies are and should be in our cities in order to promote, transport-oriented development, to promote high skill development, higher service level employment, and what the local politics, what the forces of local politics at play are driving, big gap between that policy and the politics of the day. And I think my own experience is that that's possibly most accentuated of all the cities I explored when I was a member of the COAG Cities panel. The forces of the gap that are driving the gap between policy and politics are probably at their strongest in Sydney, at least in my observation. Now, what do we know? We know that demographics are working very powerfully in our cities now and across our nation, but particularly in our cities. We are all living in cities with ageing populations. There is a growing rise of baby boomer empty nesters who are seeking more compact housing choices. They no longer always wish to have the large house and garden and obligations for car washing and gardening that requires, so that they are making living choices to live more compact lives, and typically that takes them closer to the city centre. We also know that younger people and younger families with kids these days are more ready than people ever have been in Australia before to trade space for centrality and convenience, to trade space for cityness. A word I use is cityness rather than densification. It's a terrifyingly bureaucratic term. Not that bureaucratic terms are bad in an audience like this, but it really puts people off. So especially Gen Y people are not only trading space for convenience, they're also giving up on ever wanting to drive cars. They're very happy with public transport. So preferences and population are driving outcomes in our cities. Now, the idea of agglomeration economics, which is about as scary a thought as densification, are very much at play in our cities and our city regions in Australia and right around the world. Enrico Moretti's very seminal work called The New Geography of Jobs, published last year, and Ed Glazer's work, The Triumph of the City, show us so clearly that cities thrive and prosper, or city regions thrive and prosper, the more people are educated and the more able that they are able to participate in an economy of which high value services and I guess in innovation industries are a key part of that city economy. And what's interesting about what Moretti said is that the well-being of these prosperous agglomerated cities isn't just experienced on the part of the smart people with the talented $500 an hour jobs or the entrepreneurs. That wealth actually filters down to non-skilled people who service those high income earning people. And that's why it's really important for any city to look at the importance of attracting and retaining smart people. Now, the mayor of Bogota, and I can't remember his name, but and I think I'm going to mangle his quote, but he said something which is very telling and very compelling that really gives a message of what we should think smart cities are. And smart cities and developed nations are not ones where poor people aim to own cars. It's where wealthy people are very happy to use mass transit. That, to me, is one of the defining ideas that we drive towards if we're going to have smart cities, the idea that everybody is happy to use mass transit, not because I'm a public transport nut. It's because it shows very clearly that people are happy to be part of the urban economy by not necessarily owning a motor car, which implies a much more efficient use of resources and in Sydney anyway, the preparedness to travel much more quickly, although with lots of other people. Cities are more sustainable the more dense they are, the more city-ish they are. Now, David Owen, in his book about New York, which was published a few years ago, made that point very clearly. In Manhattan, people have the lowest energy use per capita, and they also have the lowest automobile dependency per capita. So smart cities are dense and concentrated. And smart cities understand that the greatest capital we have is the capital between our ears, not the capital sitting in banks, and certainly in the Australian context, not the capital sitting in the form of resources under the Earth's surface. The greatest capital of any city, any nation is in our collective brains. In many cities in Australia, we have quite a lot of dysfunctionality between governance and the policies that will lead us to smart cities and better cities. And in Australia, we have had, in most cities, certainly Sydney in particular, but also Melbourne and Adelaide and Perth is changing, but there has been a tendency towards very fragmented local government. Now, that drives a situation where it's only the state government that has the if you like, the administrative reach to talk on behalf of the city, but inevitably state governments also are responsible for regional areas. So it gives Australian cities in my opinion, a huge deficiency and competitive disadvantage when it comes to competing with the rest of the world. Because there's no doubt that the ideal state, organisational state for a city to have, a large metropolitan region to have, is to be a city-state. And think of our neighbours to the near north. Think of Singapore, think of Hong Kong, think of, large, very global international cities like New York, London, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all these, even Beijing, Shanghai, all these cities have very city-based, metropolitan city-based government, which means that the leaders of our cities can actually speak for the whole city without speaking for other regions on the fringe in the countryside. So that gives them an incredibly powerful organising idea to think strategically and to think smart about our cities. So and that's actually one of the advantages that Canberra has, I might say. Just compressing those two layers of government is an extraordinary advantage for Canberra, and I think that the government here has been very clever about taking advantage of that. And when I come down here, typically stay when Malcolm's in, my husband's in politics, it's fantastic to see the positive change that Canberra's been undergoing, even in my time as a sort of political spouse. It's really developing the cityness character that great cities need to have in the future. Now, in terms of the civilised conversations we need to have, often when planning development and the future of our cities is being considered, the conversation is being dominated by local issues and local forces. Now, local issues and local forces are always important, but if you aggregate those local forces around, say in Sydney's case, 41 local government areas, by definition it isn't possible to have a metropolitan conversation. I might say that's what we try to do with the Committee for Sydney, and we're not part of government, but we work with government, no matter across the political cycle. But we think that it is really important for there to be a metropolitan conversation about our cities so that they can be smarter. And one of the conversations that does break down at a local level is the conversation about making cities more city-like, about making them, intensifying their uses, about doing the things that any policymaker knows is so important, promoting integrated transport and land use and infrastructure planning, promoting transport-oriented development. The localism at which many decisions are made is often the enemy of that integrated, stitched-together thinking. So just to sum up, I think there are huge technological ways of better engaging our citizens. Lots of countries around the world are doing it. The Committee for Sydney did a report earlier, a couple of months ago, on how to do this in collaboration with Martin Stewart-Weeks. I'm not sure if he's here, but from Cisco. And the conclusions were that cities need to manifest the characteristic that they work at the art of connectedness as a key civic responsibility and capability. So that's a really important objective, and that cities must embrace the idea that the world has changed. And often the forces of localism lead to another conclusion, not that the world has changed, but that nothing must ever change. And so it's very hard to adapt and have change if at a local level that proposition is not agreed with. So there are many, many other things I can talk to you about, and I hope that you ask me some difficult questions at question time. Thank you very much.
I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and their continuing contribution to this place, this area, the site of this city, which has been in their provenance for so long. There are many claims about the creative city, the smartest city, but what is this really? The smart city requires, first of all, a trust in ideas, a genuine trust in creativity, and being happy to trust forward-looking initiatives in preference over the tacit acceptance that the stuff of the past needs to be preserved above all else. As we might expect, this leads to all manner of paradox. The symphony is to be preserved, read better funded, over the stimulation of new music, yet an old building may be raised in order to make way for new development. An old tree is fought for, way beyond its natural life, yet few, though happily increasingly more, accept the sacrifice that reducing carbon emissions demands. Most feel that in most cities, bureaucracy is heavier and more complex than it should be, so where is the fresh thinking that will clear the way for more flexible responses to the creative development of 21st century cities? Canberra began as a radical idea. In the years leading up to 2013 and in the year itself, I have not dwelt on the fact that that radical idea was never completed, though I would argue that any radical idea worth its salt is never complete in any case. It's not the stuff you set in stone after the revolution, the too solid stuff which will one day require another revolution to overturn its own worst aspects, but the revolution itself, the act of tossing out the bad stuff and embracing the new, the kind of thing that Lucy referred to in terms of embracing new technologies. It's the act of change itself which is the most important. In advance of this panel, we were asked to provide some core points around our notions of smarter, better cities. I'll deal with each of mine in order and flesh them out along the way. I begin with an overall assumption that, like beauty, concepts of smartness and goodness or betterness exist very much in the eye of the beholder. Therefore, my eye sees, number one, public transport is widespread, inspiring, safe, clean, efficient, sustainable and inexpensive. Walter Burley Griffin of Chicago, in his original plan, which won the 1911 international competition for a new city to be built from scratch as the new capital of the still very young Commonwealth of Australia, incorporated both high-density habitation in the centre and trams to link the more spacious satellite residential hubs. These happen to be the two things that Canberrans now acknowledge as fundamental to a sustainable future for the capital and are also fundamental to most smart city thinking worldwide. Why didn't they happen 70 years ago? Griffin's wife and professional partner, Marion Marnie Griffin, wrote a song which is included in her rambling epic, The Magic of America. This unpublished tome, though you can read it online through the Art Institute of Chicago, was written at a time when Marion had perhaps already begun the slow, sad descent into dementia. Still, it is fascinating and often insightful, a particular testament to their lives and work. In it, she includes the lyrics for a song, which I will be singing in front of several thousand people this Saturday at the new National Arboretum, Canberra. Now, there's a smart idea, and I'll come back to it. The song is set to an old song called A Froggy Would A Wooing Go, and it tells the tale of their work in Canberra. It begins with, Walter B. would a city build, hey-ho, says Rowley, even if him and his wife it killed, hey-ho, says Anthony Rowley. She goes on, he started to work with astonishing vim, all day and all night weren't too much for him, but just about then his troubles began, hey-ho, etc. The director of works was a terrible man. And the question by the person who gave me these lyrics, the local journalist Ian Warden, questions, was this Percy Thomas Owen, director of works at the time, and insisted on following his own plan. She then goes on in the song to tell of her own woes as he worked so hard in Melbourne while she was alone in Sydney. And finally, he talked to members of Parliament, hey-ho, says Rowley. He caught them on trains as they came and they went, showed the absurdities of the intent of high mucky monks of the department. And then it ends on a high note to say it'll all be all right in the end because Walter persuaded his case. So you see that Marion Marnie Griffin lay the trouble right at the feet of the public service. I guess it may have been the same root cause for the opening debacle of the Sydney Opera House and the interference of the department under David Hughes. My advice for our smart cities in the future is quite simple. Defend and implement great city plans with integrity. Try not to tweak beautifully shaped, well-considered plans for political exigency. Oh, you who nobly serve the public, serve them with courage. Composer Andrew Schultz used some beautiful texts for his Symphony No. 3 Century, our Centenary commission for the big birthday we had here on the 11th of March this year. One of the texts was from Daniel Burnham, one of Walter Burley Griffin's great guiding lights, and it was sung by a children's choir. Make no little plans, they have no magic. Make big plans, aim high, in hope and work. A noble plan, a diagram, once drawn, is made. A noble, logical diagram, once recorded, will never die, but will be, when we are dead, a living thing. It will insist, let your watchword be order and your beacon beauty. Number 2, quality fresh food is widely and inexpensively available throughout local markets. The site of the new capital was a matter of huge national debate. It was never just a stoush between Melbourne and Sydney. When it was decided that it would be in New South Wales, but at least 100 miles from Sydney, the field narrowed and eventually the district of Yass, Canberra was chosen. This was a region originally of Aboriginal habitation and visitation as clans moved long distances for ceremony and law in the mountains. This Indigenous population was pressed aside by pastoralists and it became a great food-producing area, which was in turn pressed aside for the establishment of a new capital for a very young Commonwealth. And indeed, when work dried up at the Snowy Mountains scheme and workers from Europe came down to Canberra, they eventually were pressed aside because there was the need for the lake. So a constantly transitory society. Nevertheless, this remains a great food-producing area. Janet Jeffs is the chef at the new National Arboretum Canberra. That very smart idea, visionary beyond the terms of any political term and indeed any lifetime, apart from perhaps the babies born on the 12th of March, Canberra's 100th birthday, to whom we gave Centenary medallions and who are symbols of the first generation of which the majority is estimated to live 100 years and more. Janet works on the 100-mile principle, essentially cooking only with ingredients from within that radius. This gives her the best of the pristine coastal waters, the best of fruit and vegetables in between, the finest of flesh and fowl from the limestone plains and surrounding hills. Sherry McArdle grows truffles the size of bowling balls on a property near the airport here. I have seen, I have smelled, I have inhaled. Canberra has splendid fresh food markets at the Showgrounds Weekly and at Fish Week. This year, the school children of Canberra celebrated with their own grown market day, beautiful vegetables that had been grown and put on sale by them, and my highlight of the year, chicken of the century, though not destined for the table, more a beauty contest for their chooks. It was a fantastic day. Canberra is seriously advantaged in its access to good, fresh food. The challenge is A, first make sure that people can get there on public transport, B, make local produce affordable. Where is the genius amongst you and your colleagues who can find someone to work out that for your smarter, better city? Make fresh local seasonal food not only desirable and affordable. Out the back of my accommodation here, I hear chooks, I see lemons growing, I get tomatoes from friends and colleagues. It's a good sign. Can we all make that happen effectively and affordably in larger cities? 3, new housing is sustainable, well-designed, affordable, in attractive precincts which are both social, shops, cafes, etc., and green, all linked easily by that brilliant public transport system. How do you impose good design? The Nishi apartment building here is close to opening. It is reckoned to be the highest environmentally sustainable rated apartment building in the country, around 8 stars in many parts of the building. Canberrans were consulted a few years ago about their future choices. They said they didn't want to lose the best of that Griffin-planned city in the landscape, that vast amount of green we observe, that rural and spacious mood. But they also recognised that there needed to be a greater density centrally, as Griffin originally planned. They had no problem with this, providing it is well designed. Nishi is a good example, and not only is it well designed, quite beautiful as well as efficient, but leads to my 4th point. The smart city upholds and champions Article 27 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which reads, "Everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits." Nishi and the entire New Acton inner city precinct has culture embedded. Public art is embedded within the precinct. Nishi has an 8-screen cinema complex at the ground floor level, and even prior to opening has held design exhibitions in other unfinished spaces. Within the precinct is a courtyard regularly used for arts and cultural events and another separate gallery space for similar activities. The FKPDs who have developed this whole site are also philanthropists who support arts and culture in addition to the constant process of commissioning of art and design that they are engaged in. There's been a great deal written about the creative city. Richard Florida, Charles Landry, with whom I've worked, and many others who have followed them or picked up their slogans. But the rhetoric doesn't always match the practice. Here in Canberra, the development of inner city Braddon for art and design pop-ups, the enabling of new institutions like the Belconnen Arts Centre and the Kingston Visual Arts Precinct, along with the Centenary's championing of hundreds of local artists in all genres, means that this city's future now has a very good base from which it can promote the value of having creatives working and living in any city. They stimulate neighbours, encourage new cafes, new social life, create the kind of buds which detractors like to say Canberra doesn't have that buzz. But as the new Festival of Independent and Experimental Art, You Are Here, commissioned by the Centenary, proves, that is just a silly and outdated misconception. And thanks, Lucy, for referring to that new mood that you detect in your time here. As for science, here is the home of the CSIRO, inventor of Wi-Fi. Here, in architect Roy Ground's sensational Shine Dome, there is a rich seam of scientific knowledge freely available to the public in seminars and addresses. At the equally beautiful architecture of the John Curtin Medical Centre at the ANU, scores of PhDs beaver away at experiments in things like immunology, not just for the benefit of the locals, for Canberrans, but indeed for the world. And we might say the same of the Deep Space Tracking Station at Tidbinbilla. NASA tweeted during the Mars landing, "Thanks to our friends in Canberra, we couldn't have done it without you." At Nicta, the bionic eye is in full test mode and the first implant has been done. This city has its science close, at hand and available. In addition, the winning entry of the Capathetical is radical and corresponds to the embrace of sustainability and culture. The Capathetical was the Centenary's international design competition for a hypothetical capital for Australia in the 21st century. Responding to some of the provocations we made, the winner retained Canberra in its current place while developing a new northern centre, linked cleverly by the Griffin design and on the shores of Lake Argyle in the Kimberley. The northern capital was posited as the administrative centre of Asian and Australian Indigenous engagement. As well as embracing all the art and culture which that implies, it is a superb model for developing that particular landscape, using its plentiful water supplies, turning it into a much-needed source of food production in the north. And can you imagine yourselves, as part of the public service, up in that very glorious landscape, so close to Asia in what is called the Asian century? Number 5, all of the above is introduced equally into the lives of the young as they enter the education system. They are safe to travel on public transport, they eat good food and learn to grow and prepare it at school. Design, architecture, arts and civics and the notions of innovation and creativity are part of the curriculum from day one. Canberra has begun to recognise the shortcomings in an education system already ranked high in the country. Yesterday, the Centenary School Coordinators began the process of retaining these coordinator roles beyond 2013, as they have recognised the great value in projects which collaborate widely between schools, not just intra-school. The testing of the civics curriculum has already begun in the ACT. The city is of a size which can manage collaboration. A big regional city with absolutely first-class research facilities and the multiple stimulation of national institutions such as the National Museum of Australia and the Australian Institute of Sport. Finally, number 6, inclusion is key. Young, old, of different abilities and different cultural backgrounds. The concept of lifelong education is championed through a multiplicity of quality free events that stimulate the brain. Again, this is enabled by inexpensive public transport for the old and the young, but already there is a vast wealth of free events and activities in which older and retired citizens can utilise. I have addressed University of the Third Age events which draw audiences in their hundreds. I believe that Canberra probably has the best educated volunteer pool in the country. We used many of them and also pointed out in advance that most of the exhibitions and so many of the talks and musical events would be completely free throughout the year. They report back to me that it has been a fantastic year for them and they long for it to continue. Over to the passion and commitment now of not just the politicians but the public service here in Canberra. That engagement of more mature energies and collective wisdom is just as important as the involvement and seduction of those smart young things normally pitched as the most essential ingredient of a smart city. All in all, I hope what you glean from this, from not a Canberran but a South Australian as I am, is that our, and I mean all of us, our national capital is already a very smart city and still very much in its youth, destined without question to be smarter and better over the next 100 years. Thank you.
I am from Canada, so I have about a 16-hour time lag. And I am from Ontario, and my office is in Toronto, so I have to deal with that mayor. But I live in Mississauga. My mayor is a young lady who is 93 years old, has been mayor for 35 years, and I was city manager of that city for 10 of them. She doesn't do crack, she doesn't smoke marijuana, and she doesn't drink and drive. So I wanted to clear that up quickly because everywhere I go in the world these days, I get asked that question. So I want to talk today, David has given you a little bit of my background, so I have a deep, deep passion for cities. My career in public service was all in cities, but for a short period of time when I was the Deputy Minister of Energy for our province or state. So my passion in life has been cities and continues to be cities. I have the privilege now of working with KPMG with my partner Mick Allworth, who many of you know. Mick's here based in Canberra, I'm based in Toronto, but we manage the global cities portfolio for KPMG. So in that capacity, we spend a lot of time traveling to emerging countries, think India, China, Indonesia, Africa, South America, countries that are just beginning to develop, and we work primarily with the large emerging cities in those countries. So my comments today are going to be relative to that experience and that intense association with emerging cities in the world. And my comments will be a little bit different than you may normally expect somebody like me who's had all of the experience I've had in cities around the term smart cities. So, let's see this again. So the International Data Corporation defines smart cities as a finite entity with its own local governing authority that uses ICT, information communication technology, and instrumentation technologies to achieve the explicit goals of improving the quality of life of its citizens and sustainable economic development. That is the template definition of a smart city, if you want. I refer to as wires and boxes being used to create an opportunity to make the affairs of the operation of a city a little more efficient. But this is one of many definitions of a smart city that seems to be a subject that is struggling for common definition. I refer to it, I refer to it as a term that speaks to the use of technology to make the provision of municipal services more efficient. But to me, that is the end game of the term smart city. I'd like to spend some time today exploring the things that make a city smart before you can apply the technology that ultimately makes it easier for citizens to take advantage of their smart city. I would like to start by speaking a bit about the need for sustainability and the vision of a city. The term smart city is being bandied around the emerging countries and their cities as if it was the single solution to all of their problems. I believe that before a city can be labeled as a smart city, it has to have the basic ingredient that gives purpose and meaning to social inclusion and public services that are designed and implemented in a sustainable fashion. It would not be of much long-term benefit to produce a smart card for a transit system that does not provide equal access to all citizens of the city. And yet some would call the implementation of a smart card for transit as qualifying a city to be smart. I would consider this to be a bit of a reach when the system that is purported to be smart only serves a part of the population and thus has not been designed to be a sustainable part of the city's public service. The debate on the effects of inequality of policies oriented towards creating smart cities is, in my opinion, far from being resolved. I do not embrace the concept of a smart city, I do embrace the concept of a smart city, but my hypothesis is that there is so much more to do before you can move technology into place to make the service delivery smart in the context of the current definition of a smart city. In my opinion, unless a city is sustainable and livable, it cannot be considered a smart city, regardless of how much technology you bring into play. If I may quote from an article by Kenneth Keller in the Johns Hopkins graduate publication called Sequeira, the usefulness of technology depends on its integration with other forms of human capital, and implementation must proceed with sensitivity to its limitations and broad effect. In a sense, the smart city concept requires and encourages a clarity of society's values, not only how we want the city to function efficiently, be economically competitive, and provide a comfortable place to live, but also whether the city we design is a proper expression of the society's deepest values. The notion of smart cities epitomizes the role that new technologies can play in coping with the challenges of urbanization. I accept that. But the fundamental challenges of urbanization cannot be resolved by the use of technology. It is quite impossible, in my mind, to make bad urbanization smart. So where do we start as a society in trying to build the foundations of a city that can be ultimately moved to a higher level with the use of technology? We start by defining the kind of city we want. We build in sustainability measures and equality in both society and economy. And most of all, we engage citizens in defining the final product by bringing them into the discussion about the built form of their city and all of the societal and physical characteristics that they expect. We do not start with technology. We end with technology. You have all heard of the term associated with a computer, garbage in and garbage out. It means if the inputs are bad, so will the outputs be bad. If we apply technology to bad city systems, we don't make them better, we make them worse, because eventually this smart technology will fail because the inputs were bad to start with. I caution then against this mad rush to the holy grail called the smart city. It is indeed the ultimate conclusion and can be a very powerful addition to the fabric of any community, but it can also be a false sense of achievement if the inputs are bad. I think it is time to step back and really think through the expectations of a city. Cities are the drivers of our economy, and after hundreds of years, senior levels of government and the business community are finally waking up to the potential of cities. This evolution needs time to mature, especially in the emerging world. It has had a long history of evolution in the developed world and is much more mature. The application of technology to our everyday lives is moving at a pace far faster than we can keep up with. But it is not the answer to the basic problems facing the developing world, nor for that matter, parts of the developed world. Some would argue that the use of technology can quicken the pace of societal development, and that the smarter we make a city, the easier it will be for people to take advantage of what the city has to offer. It will provide better access to information, a more efficient system of service delivery, and even better access to the information needed to make the best decisions. I read somewhere once that children need to hear about 20,000 words a day to achieve the level of communication necessary to be able to develop a competitive communication skill. In underprivileged homes, by the 4th grade, children will have heard 30 to 40 million fewer words than their more well-off comparators. That applies to the developed world. Imagine the difference in the developing world. I found this to be a rather startling statistic, especially given all of the technology that is available to students today and the massive advances in accessibility to technology. On reflection, though, I realized that technology cannot fix this issue. Instead, inclusiveness and equality have to be in place at the most fundamental level before we can apply the equalizing benefits of technology. I feel the same way about smart cities. A smart city must begin with the fundamental equality of society in order that all of the members of that society can benefit from their smart city. Addressing the topic of people and communities as part of the smart city discussion is crucial and has traditionally been neglected in favor of understanding how technology can help deliver a better service. We need to carefully ensure that our cities are prosperous and efficiently managed before we layer on the tremendous benefits of technology. The people and the communities have to work. They have to contribute to economic growth through productivity, generating the income and employment that afford adequate living standards for the whole community. Cities provide the social services, education, health, recreation, safety, and security, etc., required for improved living standards, enabling the population to maximize potential and lead fulfilling lives. A city is only successful to the extent that poverty and inequalities are minimal. No city can claim to be successful when large segments of the population live in abject poverty and deprivation, as I have seen in the emerging countries. I maintain that no city can truly be called a smart city until these basic requirements are fulfilled. Let me move for a moment to my second thought about what makes a city smart, and that is built form and sustainability. Much has been written about the sustainability in cities over the past decade. Urbanization is considered by many to be the sole driver of economic prosperity of cities. Yet at the same time, it poses environmental and other threats that could significantly reduce the benefits of growth. Sustainable development is really economic growth that improves lives without exhausting the environment or other resources. The ability of a city to build sustainability into its urban form and structure can become the foundation for the application of technology to take it to the next level and take full use of the tremendous benefits that technology has to offer. If we are careful in our urban planning and put in place the basic needs of sustainable development, such things as water supply, affordable housing, healthcare, and education, we begin to sow the seeds that can drive the leveling of the playing field for all citizens. Only then can we think seriously about the application of technology to provide better access to these services. Couple these with the need for good transit systems and measures that contain pollution and wastewater runoff, and we begin to see the fundamental building blocks of the city start to take shape. Once we have thought out how we will move people and goods and services, using a well-planned transportation system as an example, only then can we apply technology to the delivery of a service in a manner that makes access to schedules and options a real benefit. This is smart development that helps build a smart city. If the system doesn't work and provide reliable services, what good is technology to tell you that the transit times are good on your smartphone? Technology must be an enabler that is part of the evolution of a city. If we use technology smartly, as we build our urban form and as we put in place the basic services of our cities, We have the benefit of technology being embedded in the process. It would seem to me that with technology as an enabler early on in the urbanization process, using technology to become a smart tool to ultimately deliver services will be much easier. So a smart city does not use technology to provide efficient and more accessible services. It builds technology into the urban form that ultimately wants to be smart enough to deliver for the expectations of the community. What is the benefit, for example, of installing smart meters for power consumption and monitoring and initiating time of use pricing for electricity when little attention is paid to the demand management or supply considerations or related electricity resource management solutions? If technology is used to help with demand management to inform the consumer of load forecasts and pressures, then smart technology can be the means by which the consumer can adjust their consumption accordingly. Smart meters simply tell you how much electricity you are using, but not when to use it in an economical way that allows you actually to save money. While our current emphasis on technology solutions has become the fundamental driver of the so-called smart city, it risks becoming the end itself rather than the means to an end. In my career as city manager in Canada, I have always been keenly aware of the benefits of technology as a tool to help me manage better by having access to data that help me understand the needs of the community. It never, though, gave me the potential of understanding why things happened. Data gave me statistics on what happened. In my last city, the city of Mississauga, we initiated, as an example, a Safe City Council that we used to help us understand how our built form can be designed to help us create an environment where the community can be made safer from crime. That committee engaged our urban planners and designers, the emergency services personnel, police, fire, and ambulance, our engineers and parks personnel to help us understand how designing a neighborhood can, at the very early stages of the planning process, lead to a safer community. We carefully thought out the process of a safe community as it was being planned. We used technology to help us design the best lighting on paths in the parks, and where to plant the trees, and how the houses would be set back. And we built the fire lanes early into the process to allow for better access. This is smart use of technology. Do we have a smart city? Yes, we do in that particular area because we did the smart thing at the beginning rather than layer it on afterwards. Now we use technology to give our citizens access to these facilities, times of operation and online borrowing of books from a library as an example, and the police can monitor our parks and pathways using technology. To me, this is how we make a city smart. Does it cut down on crime? Did it cut down on crime in these areas? Yes, compared to the older neighborhoods where we built before we had our Safe Cities Council. And the statistics prove it. I'm confident that our future communities will benefit from this strategy and that technology will become an even larger part of our planning and design strategies. I would like to conclude by saying that I am a strong advocate of smart cities. I can see the benefit of aggregating data from a number of sources for optimizing decision making at the city level. We know that data can come from all kinds of sources, be it monitors, embedded systems, sensors, or even smartphones that we all carry around in our pockets. We can push information to our citizens, and we can allow them to select customized data and information on our city services according to their needs. What I advocate, though, is the compelling need to use technology as an enabler early on in the process of urbanization and to help us build and design technological solutions into the very fabric of our cities. I advocate ensuring that before we go off on a tangent of declaring ourselves a smart city, we have the inclusive societal safeguards built into our planning process that allow everyone to have access to their smart city. And finally, I advocate that it is well planned from the beginning that clearly thinks through the infrastructure sustainability that will create a smart city that will not use up our valuable resources for the sake of being smart. We have some very important opportunities in the emerging world to get it right. Get it right the first time. And those of us who are the drivers behind the technology and the use, and those of us who are professionally planning and managing cities, it is up to us to ensure that technology and city building work in parallel to create the true smart city. Thank you for this opportunity to give my perspectives on what makes a city smart. I accept that it may not be the conventional thinking around smart cities, but I can assure you that it is a very necessary component of calling yourself a smart city before using technology to its greatest advantage. Thank you.
We've got a bunch of questions that have manifested on this magic tablet, and what I'm going to do is I've just made a selection of some of the questions, and I'm just going to throw it open to all of the panelists, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to read them all out at one go, and you know, panelists, if there's anything that you want to respond to or anything that you want to raise, or even refer to each other's talks, feel free to do that. Okay. So the first question: what are the most important bones of the cities that need to operate and function best? Do smarter and better cities enable the capacity for smarter and better nations? How can Canberra retain and attract people in a difficult time for employment opportunities? What about the increase of rubbish and crime that come along with density? What about the outer burbs and issues of cityness exclusion? What can individuals do to make a smarter, better city? Can smarter, better cities be affordable, or are they necessarily expensive? And is there a correlation between the width of broadband and the depth of one's knowledge, the height of one's creativity, and the quality of one's life? So I'm just going to open it up.
That's a hell of a question, David.
Yeah, these are like the grand opera of questions. But I think speculation about some of this is actually really, really fruitful. And given that we're talking about three cities, well, people have got experience across a number of cities that aren't that diverse. It'd be great to hear from you about those.
Well, I mean, number one, I found that interesting, given that I've spent a lot of time in Tokyo, which is ultra dense, ultra safe, and ultra clean.
Exactly.
And so I ask myself, it doesn't have to be natural, and I think it comes back to the values that you were talking about, David, is that when there is a sort of a population whose collective care has values in those things for the quality of life of their citizens, it doesn't necessarily get worse as it gets denser. And is that just part of the Japanese soul, part of the aesthetic, part of what respect for each other is something very, very deeply ingrained?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's any necessary correlation between cleanliness and urbanisation. I think a lot of cities, and I think that's one of the great things that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of cities that were formerly really quite grubby, like New York was one example I can think of, are much cleaner. And crime rates. Somebody asked a question about the correlation between crime and cities. There is an enormous variability of crime rates across cities. There's no kind of city of $20 million, 20 million people has a crime rate of X. There's no kind of correlation of crime and the size of cities. A lot of, smaller provincial cities have very high crime rates, which you wouldn't expect to find if there was a sort of like a linear correlation between size and crime. And I mentioned the book by David Owen, which was published I think about 5 or 6 years ago, called Green Metropolis. And it's always going to depend on what metrics and performance indicators you use, but there is no doubt that because people in New York live in very small apartments for the most part, they are not going to generate as much electricity, and therefore they're going to have a much smaller carbon footprint than somebody living in a huge McMansion on a city edge, so or in the countryside. So the correlation between density and pollution and carbon footprint, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what drives pollution and carbon intensity in any economy. Similarly, in city centres, you do have public transport choices, and having mass transit, what they call in the States public transport choices, is a very important part of a city's sustainability and smartness. I can't think of any really smart city that hasn't at least got a huge growth in mass transit services or lines or routes or whatever you'd like to call it, and that all the performance measures are going up in that respect. I don't think there's any smart city with a declining modal split between public transport and motor vehicle use, for example.
So, David, I often get asked, because of what I do, what cities I consider to be great cities in the world. And I've thought about that to some extent and have landed on a few that I'll just mention now. Lucy mentioned New York City. I think New York City is a city that works. Mayor Giuliani, when he was mayor, really is the fellow who got rid of crime in that city. It was a terribly unsafe city 20 years ago, and Rudy Giuliani cleaned that up. Michael Bloomberg came in, he's now leaving, and concentrated on making New York a viable, livable city. He is a patron of the arts. He did a tremendous amount of work in promoting the city and encouraging people to visit the city, kind of the turnaround from it being unsafe. Bilbao, Spain is another example of a great city, in my mind, basically an industrial city that collapsed and reinvented itself as a major cultural and artistic hub in Spain. The Guggenheim Museum is located there. If you ever get a chance to go see it, it's quite spectacular. These many Scandinavian cities who've taken from the very beginning a tremendous respect for sustainability and the environment, and have built great cities by being very careful about how they treat the environment in their city. Tokyo, Robyn mentioned Tokyo, I think is a wonderful example of a city that works despite all the economic issues it's had over the years. It is a city that works. And finally, I would land on a city, Singapore is a city that I think that works fairly well. Now, Singapore is a unique city in the world. It is what we call a city-state. So it's a federal, provincial, or state and city government all combined into one. So it's very easy to make decisions in that city. There aren't 3 levels of government, and there aren't hundreds of departments. They really do make their decisions very efficiently. So those are the kinds of cities that I look at around the world and think, you know what, I think they've kind of got it.
And what would you see as the kind of common thread that runs through those cities?
So one of the most important things that runs through those cities is the pride of the people who live there. They genuinely like their city. I spend a lot of time in taxis around the world, as you can imagine, and one of my favorite questions to the taxi driver after I ask him how much it's going to cost to get me to the hotel is, tell me about your city. How do you like your city? How do you like living here? And those people that drive taxis around the world have probably the best perspective of their city of anybody, because they are the people that live in the city and live normally not at the higher end of the society, but the basic services. And I get some very interesting comments from them. So let me just go to another one of the questions, and I found it interesting. I think it was, what are the bones of a city?
Yeah, so what are the most important bones of the cities that operate and function best?
Yeah, so I would land squarely on a couple of things that I think are the bones, the fundamental bones that make a city work. First and foremost, you will have heard from my comments that I'm a kind of person who has a great deal of respect and a great deal of belief in encouraging citizen participation and engagement in a city. So I think, although most people would say bones are a hard thing in a city, I really believe that cities are successful if they're an inclusive environment and encourage participation from the public, and that the governance of the city reaches out to the public to seek that input. So I would put that as very high up on my list of the bones that make a city work. Obviously, you need good infrastructure. You need infrastructure under the ground and on top of the ground. You need the pipes and the water and the things that make a city work from that perspective, and you need all the transit systems and all those other things. And if you look at the emerging cities in the world where I spend most of my time, both those things are missing. In places like Mumbai and Delhi in India, or Beijing, or other big, large cities in China, there is a tremendous oppression, I believe, of the fundamental basic requirements of the citizens of some of those cities. They're too big, the infrastructure doesn't work, they're not inclusive to a large extent, and large parts of the population are severely marginalized. I'll give you a couple of statistics. By the year 2050, 3 billion more people will move into cities. Now, in an emerging world, in emerging cities, the infrastructure is barely, it's not even barely, it just does not stand up to the demands that are placed on it by the citizens that already live there. Can you imagine 3 billion more people moving into these centers? And that urbanization is going to take place in China, India, and continental Africa. So without that basic bone called infrastructure, the city is destined to fail. By 2017, 100 million people, 100 million people, I think that's 2.5 or 3 times the population of Australia. It's certainly a couple of times the population, or 3 times the population of Canada. 100 million people will live in a slum. That's a staggering statistic when you think about it.
I just want to interrupt, David, and just bring Robyn and Lucy into this conversation about bones and what you see are the, the sort of key bones that make a city work, particularly given your work in Sydney and, Robyn, your work over the last couple of years in Canberra. What do you see as the kind of things that hold those values up?
Well, I think, and nobody's ever going to have the same opinions in any city. There's always going to be a huge diversity of views. But I think what David was saying, there needs to be a sense of pride and belonging, and the city in certain way has to be lovable. That doesn't mean it has to be as clean as the model Swiss city. I mean, cleanliness is always a good thing, not a bad thing, but it needs to be lovable. And infrastructure is very important, but I think sort of graininess and grittiness is quite lovable too. So I think that you need to have a whole multiplicity of things working, so that the functionality is really important. But there needs to be glue, sort of like a social glue, not a sort of like a people can't be standardised and sort of the same. That's never going to be a good thing. But there has to be a sense of glue and belonging to one place, and that's why I think the governance structures are so important with cities. And in Sydney, which I suppose I know more about than anywhere else, and any big city has this challenge. New York's another example, and any big city has this challenge. You have pockets of advantage, typically in the city centre or in affluent suburbs, and you have pockets of relative disadvantage. In the developing world, extraordinary disadvantage. In the developed world, there is a big disadvantage-advantage gap. But what you need to do is to always make the institutions and the city accessible, no matter what your demographic, your social and your net personal wealth is. You need to feel just as much a part of Sydney if you are, no matter what your financial position, and you need to feel that you have access to what makes the city lovable. And when people feel estranged and isolated from the city, I don't think it works very well.
It's interesting that you mentioned the pride factor. Just like last week, the Chief Minister of the ACT said in a speech that she thought that one of the greatest legacies of the Centenary year would be an increased pride by the citizens. There has been this phenomena of Canberra bashing that's been going on for many years, when people who have a certain temporary dissatisfaction with the government or policy or politicians or whatever tend to use Canberra. They say, I hate Canberra, when actually they don't mean that at all, and in fact most of them don't know anything about the city. So this notion of increasing pride in the capital was absolutely top of the agenda for the centenary year. So what's interesting is that I think that there is certainly a rather buoyant mood and a pride amongst citizens in Canberra. Certainly, I think, David, you'd agree that there is a high degree of what you referred to as citizen participation. There's a lot of opinion. People do turn up to meetings. They turn up to stuff everywhere. That's very interesting. Here, I think, peculiar, and there were a couple of questions that came onto the tablet about what the effect of trains and light rail would be in Canberra. And interestingly, it is one of those creaky bones in this city, precisely because if you galvanised all that pride, energy, participation via one of those effective bones cleaning up, which, as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, Walter Burley Griffin had actually designed, but it never happened. If you brought that in, you would start to integrate the city in very interesting ways. And for me, I think that the establishment of the high-speed rail, it's talked about all the time, the one that links Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, Brisbane, that high-speed rail would be I think it would change the nature of this city completely. First of all, it would absolutely, in my mind, force a light rail system that would connect the bits of the city and then connect to the rail system that would connect to the capitals. So suddenly, if people suddenly thought that they could live in the beautiful green surrounds of Canberra and be at their job in Sydney in 45 minutes, there would be a change of, even to the extent that there would be need to be more land for sale. You might have to expand the borders. I mean, it would be on for one and all, I think. So this city is interesting in that many of the things that you both say are most valuable in a, and is it, somebody asked the question, is it an intelligent city? Is it by definition technologically the smart city, or is it livable? Probably the better city is a combination of all those things. But it seems to me that here you already do have a number of elements of those things, but there's just one of the bones that's a bit creaky. Interestingly too, when the surveyors went out, the surveyor Scrivener chose this particular site, and it was an adventurous job he did, going to the mountains with his wife to try and drive the stakes to say where the ACT would actually be. But he decided that the water here would be sufficient for 250,000 people, and it was. There are now 370,000 people. So it's a couple of those pipes, bones, resources, things that this city needs. The other bit, value, pride, inclusion. I suppose one of the things we did in the Centenary was to work towards inclusion of the local Indigenous population that didn't have a lot of profile, to make sure that people understand the cultural diversity of this city, where I believe 25% of the population at any time come from a non-English speaking background. So that's an interesting thing, where in many emerging cities what you find is what's lacking maybe, are those other things. Here those are settled, but it's the bones that just need to come together.
And look, it's really interesting after coming from the session around Asia that was sort of mid-morning, where we talked about, where there was some discussion about inclusion. And inclusion, I'm brown, and of course, what we value as inclusive in Australia is not necessarily what's valued somewhere else, and there are issues around faith and sexuality and things like that. So those, I guess, just to comment on that, like an understanding of those issues of inclusivity, some clarity around those values are some of those bones, if you like.
Yeah, it's interesting, David, from my profession being in the arts, of course the big thorn for Singapore is still that homosexuality is illegal. Yeah. So some of the most celebrated artists in Singapore, and they are celebrated, and it's sort of acknowledged under the carpet, but you're not allowed to be out front of it, right. And that is right. That's the one sort of slightly oppressive element. If they could resolve that, it would probably change the city even more, I think.
Look, we've come to the end of the session. Please join me in thanking our panellists for their generosity and really for making it quite a juicy discussion. I really appreciate it. Please thank Lucy, Robyn and David.